Gentlemen, good evening. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this timely discussion on the binational relationship in the context of Mexico's upcoming elections. As you well know, the relationship between Mexico and the United States is currently under intense scrutiny. The Trump administration is forging ahead with a plan to build a wall along the U.S. Mexico border, to deport millions of individuals, many of whom are of Mexican origin, and to revise the North American Free Trade Agreement, which has been the cornerstone of the binational economic relationship. The Trump administration clearly does not view Mexico as a partner in the context of a broader strategic relationship, but as a competitor and perhaps even as an adversary, a country that has, quote unquote, taken advantage of the United States. Complicating any forecast on the future of the binational relationship is an increasingly challenging set of issues within Mexico itself. The economy continues to wobble along, even as the world's economy as a whole is growing at a healthy pace, 3.6%. Inequality and poverty are as entrenched as ever. Enormous deficiencies in the rule of law remain, including a deteriorating public safety and security environment, constant corruption scandals, and serious threats to human, political, and civil rights. And of course, to top it up, a major presidential and congressional election, which promises to be very contentious, coming up in 2018. To discuss some of these binational and national challenges, we have called upon four well-known thinkers of public policy issues in Mexico. Each of them will share with us their own thoughts on where we are, how we got here, and what we can expect by the summer of 2018. They will cover a range of issues from NAFTA to the elections in Mexico to what we can expect in the future. As the U.S. moves into its own electoral cycle and pushes ahead through a very complicated political electoral landscape. We will hear from our panelists first, and then we will open it to a conversation with you all. You have a program in your hands. I'm not going to read their bios. You can read them in your own time. But I think it's important to know that all four of them are great thinkers of politics and public policy in Mexico, and they're good friends of the Mexico Center and myself. I met them in different forums. Luzma, I heard her speak about the NAFTA agreement in August, late August, at the Senate in Mexico City. And Gerardo was also a colleague that called for a conversation on binational issues in August. Carlos Angulo is a good friend from the U.S. Mexico border in Ciudad Juarez and a former member of Congress. He saw through the energy reform and telecommunications reform and other important structural reforms in Mexico that today define the landscape in Mexico. And of course, John Ackerman from the National University in Mexico City, and a public intellectual who writes for various newspapers, journals, and magazines in Europe and North America. So I want to welcome them all, and we will start in that order as they're sitting. John, and then Carlos, and then Luzma, and then Gerardo, about 15 minutes each or so, and then we will open it to a conversation. John, you're up first.
Thank you, Tony.
Mm-hmm. You can
15 inches, so
you can stand over here or sit, either way.
I'll stand up. It's a good idea. So I guess I was expecting a little bit more informal, so I wasn't, I don't have a formal PowerPoint prepared, but I do have plenty of things to say, so this will be a fun exchange. Thank you so much, Tony, an honor to be here with you, with the colleagues here at Rice, the Baker Center, share the podium with Carlos, with Gerardo, and Luz Maria. A real pleasure and honor. Mexico is today in the middle of a very serious economic and political crisis. My area of expertise is particularly on politics, on law. I'm a professor at the Institute for Legal Research. My most recent book, I'll hold it up to you a little bit, is called, no, that's the journal. That's the journal. That's Mexican Law Review. That's the one I edit. That's my book. Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. It's called The Myth of Democratic Transition in Mexico. And I think that's the correct way to approach Mexican politics today. We've been sold a myth that somehow in the year 2000 there was a magical transformation in the coordinates of politics, in the functioning of the Mexican state, in the relationship between government and civil society. And there was indeed a process of political, institutional dynamism between 1997 in particular and 2012. There was a struggle, there was an effort to create new laws, constitutional reforms, participation of Congress overseeing the executive, the judiciary gaining somewhat more independence. But as we've seen over the last few years, and not only concretely because of what has occurred over the last few years, but as the conditions of the possibility for what has occurred over the last few years has demonstrated to us that all of this was really just smoke and mirrors. That in fact we continue today within exactly the same, not exactly the same, there's been changes on the surface, there's been global structural changes, but the basic dynamics of politics in Mexico are the same they have been since 1946. Now, suppose in the year 2000 we said goodbye to 71 years of the regime of the party state, right? The precursor to the PRI was the PRM, the PNR. This was created in 1929. Suppose in the year 2000, 71 years came to an end, and we now entered into a new phase of democratic politics. But in fact, and this is what I try to write in the book I'm trying to write a book in English now to communicate these ideas to the United States, as we're trying to do here. The regime that we're into today didn't begin actually in 1929. It began in 1946. What happened in 1946? Anybody here know what important institution of the Mexican politics was created in 1946? The PRI, exactly. The Partido Revolucionario Institucional was created in 1946, but not as a party. Now it's a party. But in 1946, it was not created as a party. It was created as the covering for a new regime, which meant, as of 1946, the repudiation of the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, of the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, our Franklin Roosevelt, or the other way around. Roosevelt was your Cárdenas, however you want to see, but partners, historical partners in progressive welfare state politics. 1946 was the beginning of a new state, a state based on hypocrisy, saying that it was in favor of the general welfare, but actually institutionalizing a system of elite corruption. It is in that sexennial from 1946 to 52 in which the grand-scale complicity of corruption between the big businessmen and the government begins. That is the beginning of what we could, the seeds of neoliberal authoritarianism, which is what we still live through today. And what happened, jumping 54 years ahead of time, because we don't have time for a huge historical dissertation on this, but what happened in 2000? In 2000, there was an alternation between the PRI and the pan. But in the end, these governments from 2000, 2012, and up to the contemporary times have maintained the same, not only style, but reality of simulation, of impunity, of corruption, and of separation of the state from the demands of civil society. Now, this distinguishes Mexico from the rest of Latin America. All of the countries of Latin America, except for Mexico and Colombia and Cuba, have undergone major political transformations over the last 20 or 30 years. Every single one of them. Some of them more to the left, some of them more to the right, some of them to the center. Everybody has their favorite new leader, from Lula to Bachelet to Chavez to Evo. No? But every single one of these countries has gone through massive political transformation. They have been able to channel through formal institutional means the social discontent created during the 80s and the 90s and the failure of neoliberal policies to actually create social justice and inequality. Except for Mexico. We are stuck within the same authoritarian neoliberal system which has been in existence since 1946. The opportunity in 2018 is for Mexico to try to experiment with something new. That's what's on the table. 30 years of these structural adjustment policies, which have continued absolutely in this last few years under Peña Nieto, have led to massive social discontent. I didn't prepare a formal presentation because I wasn't expecting this format, but you look at the most recent study of GEAISA, September 2017. GEAISA is a consulting firm, a public opinion firm, which every 2 or 3 months comes out with new surveys. And we can see, this is a tendency which has been occurring over the last few years, but we can see that the popular opinion with respect to the president, Peña Nieto, with respect to the ruling party, with respect to all of the parties in the country, have reached a historical low. Mexico had stood out, even in the midst of social conflict of the 90s and the beginning of the first decade of the 21st century. Mexico had stood out as the exception in Latin America in terms of the respect for the office of the president and for institutions. Never had the public approval ratings for the president gotten below 50, 45 with Fox, Calderon at some points. But really, we had a sort of a buffer zone in which, in the end, the presidency and the office of the presidency, not just the president, but the actual public institutions, commanded respect from the Mexican people. All of a sudden, that has disappeared. The lack of respect, literally, if you go to the social networks for the president of Mexico, is absolutely different from anything we've seen over the last 20, 30 years. I think maybe here in the United States, you might be going through a similar process. I don't dare to judge on that side, but what's in Mexico, we have got, the approval ratings for Peña Nieto are now like 18%. This never happened before. Right? During the earthquakes, he didn't even personally, beyond staged events, get too close to the victims of the earthquakes. But when, for instance, Osorio Chong, his second in charge, the Secretary of Gobernación, went to one of the sites of the collapsed buildings, he was literally shouted off the scene by the families of the victims themselves. This is these are families in desperate need of government support, and they're running out from the site of a collapsed building, the man who's supposed to help them. This demonstrates symbolically the depths of the lack of trust and confidence. Now, traditional political scientists are going to be very concerned about this lack of a culture of legality. We've lost respect for the institutions. We distrust institutions and the law in Mexico. I see it the other way around. I think this actually reflects an incredible consciousness on the side of the Mexican people. I would be worried if, in the situations we have today, just yesterday, Transparency International reported that Mexico is the most corrupt country in all of Latin America. Over 50% of all Mexicans have paid a bribe in the last month, I think is the question. more than Dominican Republic, Peru, Venezuela, you name it. I mean, we're at the bottom of the barrel. In that situation, for Mexicans to trust their institutions and their politicians, to me, would be an indication of a passive society who is willing to accept the status quo as it is of corruption and destruction of legitimacy. The fact that the Mexicans do not trust these officials, these institutions, does not demonstrate a lack of culture of legality, but an advanced consciousness and high expectations of what democracy is about and what institutions are supposed to do. They are aware, they distrust because they expect and they demand more. So I actually have great hope. I think that next year could be a real parteaguas. How do we say that in English? Watershed, thank you. Forgotten my English. It could be a real watershed. Well, it's going to be a watershed, one way or the other. Next year's elections is going to be a real referendum in terms of, whether Mexico has a democracy or not. I mean, that's really the question. Or whether it still has the potential of becoming a democracy. In the last elections, most recent ones, in the state of Mexico, in June, a group of professors and students and artists and even, actors, movie actors, we got together and we put together a little society initiative called Ni un Faro de Más, in which we were observing the elections in the state of Mexico. And to us, it was very clear at the end of the game that those elections were not free and fair. There was voting intimidation, vote buying, vote stealing. There were all sorts of violations of the basic rules of the game around elections in terms of public and private financing, in terms of the counting of the votes, in terms of the review of the cleanliness of the elections by the electoral authorities. I would not dare to say that those elections were free or fair, and much less authentic, as the Mexican Constitution says they should be. The question is whether elections next year will actually be free and fair. Automatically, I don't think we can assume this will be the case. Our experience in 2006, 2012, in the presidential elections, and this most recent election, demonstrate that this system, which has been in place since 1946, is an expert at voter manipulation and fraud. That has not gone away. It is actually more present than perhaps ever before, more sophisticated, more well-financed, and more violent as well. So I think it's going to be really important for people in the United States, not the government, of course, but Mexicans and Americans in the United States to be really attentive to what is happening in Mexico, because international civil society putting a spotlight on Mexico can help us to actually have free and fair elections. And that's what we want. That's what we need. We need to be able to channel through formal institutions and political processes this citizen discontent. If not, if it continues to be closed off, the institutional exit, I don't think there'll be a violent revolution or civil war. Well, in some way, there already is a situation of civil war and violence in Mexico. We've lost, 200,000 people over the last 10 years in the drug war. Violence is a daily reality in Mexico. And that is related to the lack of democratic transition, to the lack of strength of the institutions. Because you don't have strong institutions, how are you going to actually investigate crimes? If everything is fraud and complicity and corruption, this, of course, plays into violence. And so if we don't actually achieve democratic elections next year, this could get worse, the situation, for many reasons. I don't know much, I think probably out of time. One of the important things, one of the things that explains the stability of the Mexican post-revolutionary political system. Mexico also stands out as an exception in Latin America for the lack of civil wars, golpe de estados, coup d'etats. In general, we've had, since 1934, every single president has served to the end of the 6-year term. This is unprecedented in Latin America. Right? Since 1934, since the sexenio of Lázaro Cárdenas, every single president has finished. Right? One of the reasons for this is because the two poderes fácticos, extra-institutional powers, which normally have this kind of coup d'etat or civil war mentalities, are, on one hand, the military, and the other hand, the church. These two institutions, throughout the 20th century in Mexico, have been placed on the margins because of particularities of the Mexican Revolution itself and the regime itself. But these two institutions are now coming back into the fold. And the particularly worrisome piece of this is the military. And here the United States has a direct role. Since 2002 or 3, you guys will correct me, Mexico now belongs to NORTHCOM, and military spending has increased stratospherically. Even in these last couple years in which we've had budget cuts, the institution which did not receive budget cuts is the military, and this is very much beefed up by relations with the United States, not only under Trump, but this under Obama as well, of course. And the strengthening of the military, not only as an institution, but as a political force, which it never had been really before, and it had political role, but as a independent political force, is one of the unique things about the Mexican state. As it becomes more empowered politically, this could be another factor of instability if we don't actually achieve democratic elections next year. That's probably enough to get the debate going, no, Tony?
Sure. That sounds very good.
All right.
Thank you very much, John. Carlos, your turn.
Wow. Well, I must say that I have severe discrepancies on many of the things that you said. However, I do have a lot of things that I agree. But let's start with the discrepancies, okay? The PRI, yes, it was born in 1946, but in reality it was born in 1929, okay? And the PRI is not a political party. It has never been a political party. It has been a political machine that stopped the armed chapter of the Mexican Revolution, okay? And how did it do it, okay? It was very thoughtful, I will say, but a great deal of the problems that we have in Mexico derive from that institution. That, yes, it stopped the bloodshed, and it was a lot of bloodshed. 12 million people in Mexico in those days, and we had 1 million people that were killed. Putting that into perspective in modern times is if we would have a revolution right now and 48 million people or 42 million people got killed. You know, it was really a slaughter, okay? The Mexican Revolution has been one of the deadliest in the world, okay? Well, this institution, this political machine stopped it, okay? How did it do it? Well, the Mexican Revolution was not about going against Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio Diaz went out of office in 6 months, okay? The Mexican Revolution was about struggle between chaos or chaotic parties that went into arms, with all sort of interests all over the place. And the PRI, or the Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, that was the grandfather of the PRI, was the one that settled all of this. How did this happen? Well, they made a set of rules that if you want to, sit down and read them, you will never find them. But everybody knew about the rules, okay? And the rules were, let's do the following, okay? We have 10 factions of revolutionary families, as they call them, okay? And everybody will have a chance to run the country. And that number one person, the president of Mexico, okay, that was elected among those families, okay, would be the only one that will hold power in all of Mexico and will distribute power throughout Mexico to the tiniest levels, okay, controlled by this system, okay? And they made a set of rules in order to, everybody had a piece of the cake, okay? And, you know, there was no rule of law. The only thing that is like a big mafia, okay, that, you know, everybody had a piece of the cake, but it was an orderly mafia, okay? Okay. Now, I'm 67 years of age, okay? I started in politics being a lawyer that defended elections in 1983. Francisco Barrio was elected for the first time an opposition mayor in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua. I'm from Juárez. Okay, was elected mayor, and the PRI wanted to annul the election. Okay, and he came and talked to me about, you know, helping him defend the election, and I say, I don't know the slightest thing about electoral laws. And, you know, the response was, nobody knows that in Mexico because nobody respects elections. You know, it's only a fiction. Okay, well, so I started to review my statutes, and I found out that in Chihuahua State, there was no electoral law. There was in the Constitution about 6 sections in the Constitution that talked about elections. And there was an administrative code of the state of Chihuahua that had like 4 sections only. The Constitution had more than the secondary law, okay, about elections, okay? And the elections were as follows, okay? The polling stations, okay, were run by the PRI boss of the section, 100%, okay? And the secretary was his compadre, okay, and the tally voters was the comadre, and the other tally voter was the sister of the compadre, no? Okay, everything was handled through the PRI, okay. And Pancho Barrio won an election, a mayoral election in Juárez because everybody was fed up with the PRI, okay. So it was a surprise, no? The big discrepancy that I have here with John is that, you know, we are light years away from that in Mexico. Light years away, okay? Now, each polling station is run by a citizen. By a citizen that is selected by random system, okay? Very complicated random system. And every party, every political party has a representative in the polling section. The ballots are deposited in boxes that are transparent, okay? And everybody has a voting credential with the picture on it, okay? But you don't have that in the United States, okay? Okay. This is my voting credential. It has my signature, my fingerprint, and it has a band that is electronic, etc. You know, we have the most advanced electoral system in the world. I can easily say that in Mexico. Okay? So, no, my God, you know, democracy does exist in Mexico. Yes, they do some, managing things. They do give money to people. But I can tell you one thing. My wife's grandfather studied medicine in Philadelphia, okay? And he got paid $1 to go and vote, and he was Mexican. No, so and because of that, you cannot say that in the United States there's no democracy. No, okay. Yes, there's a lot of issues with respect to democracy, and now I must tell you, okay, we are in the brink of a breakthrough in Mexico with respect to what's going to happen. Okay? If there were no democracy, we wouldn't have a fair election next year. And I believe that we're going to have a fair election next year, honestly speaking. Okay? And I do believe that we had a fair election in 2006, notwithstanding what Lopez Obrador said. Okay? Last year, we had 12 governorships that were taken away from the PRI. That's democracy for you, okay? We have had 2 consecutive PAN presidents. Yeah. What has been the issue here in Mexico, and that's the things that I agree with John, that the high bosses of business and the high bosses of politics have colluded themselves, okay, since 1946. They started with the Desarrollo Estabilizador, stabilization development, I don't know how you call that in English, okay, where all the economy was closed, okay, and here our next speaker is an expert in that field, okay, where the government promoted monopolies, okay? To give you an example, I want to be the representatives of Xerox Corporation. Okay, great. Okay, we will give you a license to be the representative of Xerox Corporation, and we will subject to import licenses 100% of the inputs to build Xerox machines in Mexico, number one. Okay, and we will not give a license to anyone else but Xerox, okay, number one. Number two, okay, we will protect, okay, any importation from any other copying machine in the world, okay, and we will not give license for importations, and if we do give some licenses, the tariffs will be 1,000%, okay, with the control prices system that existed, okay. What happened in that regard? Okay, politicians and businessmen colluding themselves, kickbacks, and I give you part of the business and things like that since 1946, and it has continued. When democracy came into Mexico in the year 1997, 2000, okay, fully established, what has happened? That those two, big, powerful sections of Mexican society, businessmen or entrepreneurs, big capital and government, got together and started to maneuver the way you can handle an election, okay? By giving money unlawfully, by paying the borders, so on and so forth, okay? So currently, we do have, okay, a democratic system that works, provided that the people vote with their heads and not with their stomach, or not with the things that are fed in social media and things like that. And right now, are in the brink of having a new election with one new player, okay? And the new player that we have is the independents that we didn't have before, okay? And everybody hates political parties. Everybody hates political parties. And number one hated political party is the PRI. Number two, probably my party, PAN. And number three, the old left-wing PRD and everybody is either thinking about voting against a political party, voting in favor of Lopez Obrador, or in favor of an independent. Nobody knows what's going to happen. And we're in the middle of this, and we can further discuss this so on forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Luzma, give us the economic story behind this story.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tony, for having me here. It's a great privilege to be here at the Baker Institute, and also it's a great privilege to share this panel with such distinguished panelists. It's very nice to have this opportunity today to share with you some remarks and some thoughts on how the NAFTA negotiation may have some impact on the U.S.-Mexico relation, which is already being seriously affected. As you know, tomorrow we will be seeing the beginning of the fourth round of NAFTA negotiations in Washington, D.C., and the predictions for what to expect are not very encouraging. In fact, they're quite worrisome. And I think that right now it's a very timely moment to think about what this means, what the renegotiation means for the future of the U.S.-Mexico relations, and what it means also for Mexico and for the election in 2018. I think it is also very difficult to predict what may come up, so I'm just going to offer some thoughts on informed analysis, but also taking into consideration that we are living through a very, very unique time, a very different way of dealing with politics and dealing specifically with trade in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So in these remarks, I'd like to focus on three issues, basically. The first one has to do with the way in which Trump, his electoral campaign, his speech, his discourse with respect to Mexico and NAFTA has really driven the U.S.-Mexico relation to a record low, which does not seem to really accord the same kind of downgrade to the trade and investment relationship that we are living. There seems to be a disconnect between the discourse of President Trump and what's going on in terms of trade between Mexico and the U.S. When we negotiated the NAFTA, and I was part of that negotiation team 25 years ago, we really thought that the NAFTA was making Mexico and the U.S., Mexico, the U.S., and Canada partners, not only in trade and investment, but also in many other areas. We thought that we had moved up the ladder in terms of the dialogue, in terms of the shared interests. However, President Trump has made up a reality check on that idea or that assumption that we could consider the U.S. our trading partner. And to a certain extent, it has also opened our eyes in terms of the complacency that we had in terms of just being satisfied with exporting 80% of our products to the U.S. market. So we have been identified by President Trump as public enemy number one. We have been trashed. We have been accused of robbing U.S. jobs, and we have been accused of taking advantage of the U.S. The question is if after 23 years of NAFTA partnership and the kind of productive integration that we have accomplished, the political rhetoric will be enough to unravel that productive integration. And my gut feeling says that it will take much more than rhetoric to unravel this productive integration. Today, Mexico is the U.S. second largest trading partner. We are the second largest export market for the U.S. after Canada. The U.S. sells abroad out of the sales that the U.S. makes, 16 cents out of every dollar are done in Mexico. Mexico exports 80% of its products to the U.S. And in terms of imports, the U.S. has Mexico as its second largest source of imports, with 14% of total U.S. imports coming from Mexico, only after China. In terms of the agricultural sector, we are the third largest export market, and we are the key buyer for products such as corn, beans, soybeans, rice, pork, poultry. So there's been a real productive integration between Mexico and the U.S. in the agricultural sector. I'm not saying that there have not been winners and losers. There have been, but it's true that under the NAFTA, the trade in agriculture has increased dramatically. So if there were not to be any NAFTA, agriculture, among many other sectors, would definitely suffer. Now, I think that even though my second point is that the NAFTA renegotiation is already redefining Mexico-U.S. Mexico-U.S. relations beyond trade. NAFTA's future right now is uncertain, at its best, and it may be close to an end if in the worst case scenario. And this is just an observation of what President Trump has been saying in his tweets and his statements and interviews since he took office on January 20th. The main reason why we are negotiating NAFTA today is a result of a campaign promise. Then candidate Trump promised to his electoral base that he would repeal NAFTA or renegotiate it in order to reverse the trade deficit that the U.S. has with Mexico. Today, that trade deficit accounts for around 8% of total trade deficit of the U.S. Compared to China, China is almost 48% of the U.S. trade deficit. It's really minor, and we would have to explore if this deficit can be accounted for intra-industry and intra-firm trade. So that number is also, something that could be questioned. He also proposed to renegotiate NAFTA in order to reverse the trend of losing manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and bringing them back to the U.S. sector, especially in the automotive sector. And also, this is a way to make America great again. So in his view, the renegotiation is payback time, and he proposes a trade agenda that is a zero-sum game, where what one party wins is the loss of the other one, which contrasts dramatically with the sense of the negotiation in the early 1990s when we had a win-win proposition where the three of us thought that producing together could increase our competitiveness and could make us a better partner in international trade. So basically, President Trump is promoting a protectionist agenda, a national economic agenda, an agenda that seeks to build a fortress in the U.S. And these economic propositions are reflected in an agenda that the U.S. has put forward already, or will apparently put forward in the fourth negotiation. And I would like to just mention a few to understand where we are standing in terms of the difficulty of this negotiation. Specifically, I would like to mention 7 areas. The first one has to do with the rules of origin. Apparently, President Trump, his administration, through the USTR, Bob Lighthizer, intends to make a proposal where rules of origin in the automotive sector, which apparently is the most important sector in terms of the changes that they want to make, they want a rule of origin that attains a level of 85%. We've never seen anything like that. 62.5 is what we have right now and is the highest among any trade agreements the U.S. has with any partner, with the inclusion of a 50% U.S. content, which is a total violation of any of international trade law, of GATT, which prohibits national content requirements. So that is a proposition that is extremely difficult to accept for Mexico and for Canada, I believe, because it goes beyond the regional nature of the agreement. Rules of origin in textiles also are intended to eliminate tariff preference levels, which intend to make the supply of inputs more available in cases where inputs are not available in the region. And that would definitely end up costing jobs in the apparel sector, not only in Mexico, but also in Canada and the U.S. Eliminating Chapter 19, I think it's one of the most clear propositions of how the U.S. intends to use trade remedy laws to increase protection for its industry in the U.S. It does not mean that Mexico or Canada cannot discuss this issue or that Chapter 19 needs to be there. Chapter 19 can be improved without a question. I've been a panelist in Chapter 19, and I know that there's plenty of room to be improved. However, the problem is that if we are going to start eliminating provisions of the NAFTA for more protectionist measures, I think that becomes a real issue for the actual modernization, if we want to see it like that, and for the actual integration of the NAFTA. What would be a more positive proposal? I don't know, but that just sends a message of how protectionist the agenda that the U.S. is imposing on the NAFTA could be. Buy America is also one of the issues that are being push for in the renegotiation for government procurement, making it more difficult for the Mexico and Canada to participate in public biddings, a sunset clause, which proposes to revise the agreement every 5 years. This is like going back to the GSP, General System of Preference, that is a unilateral system for developed countries offering access to developing countries that has to be renewed every year. This sunset clause will definitely break one of the foundations of the NAFTA, which is certainty and predictability, which is having a set of rules that we know that will stay in place for many years. Also, labor provisions are part of the proposals that seek to bring back jobs into the U.S., and something that may not be easy to accomplish. We know that there has been talk on imposing minimum wage. I have not seen, and I don't have any information regarding that language being proposed or tabled at this negotiation. There are other issues that may be part, that may be sensible in terms of the ILO conventions, but this is part of question mark in terms of how this may actually result in bringing back jobs in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. And last but not least, Chapter 11. Chapter 11 dispute settlement mechanisms for investor-state disputes, where the U.S. is apparently proposing an opt-in or opt-out mechanism, which evidently is opposed by the U.S. Business community, in the sense that it may end up eroding a mechanism that has been very efficient for the U.S. The U.S. has never lost a Chapter 11 dispute settlement case. Now, this also talks a lot about the kind of communication or lack of it between the business community and the Trump administration. These are only a few of the main challenging questions that are going to be that are already present and that may be presented or tabled the fourth round of negotiations. So these proposals are not only contentious in terms of the U.S. Mexico relationship, but they have also given a different spin to the kind of NAFTA that we may have at the beginning. So even if we don't know exactly how this negotiation is going to evolve, I think that with or without the NAFTA, the kind of trade and investment relationship that we have will somehow persist. I think that integration is a fact in many ways, and it will not automatically be stopped as a result of either President Trump presenting his denouncing of the agreement as provided in Article 2205 of the NAFTA, or if we have a longer renegotiation where eventually there's no result, where there's no result in terms of this renegotiation. It is difficult to predict whether there can be a positive result or a constructive result that satisfies the interest of the three parties, given that we have so different evaluations of the agreement. Our assessments are completely different. We come from completely different points of view, and we are expecting to accomplish something completely different. However, if NAFTA continues, we know that there are 7 rounds of negotiation proposed by the end of the year. We know that there is a very, very tight timetable and schedule for finishing these negotiations by the end of the year. I think it's extremely difficult that schedule can be accomplished. And the reason why this timetable was set was because we wanted to avoid, the U.S. and Mexico wanted to avoid getting into the Mexican election and the Mexican electoral schedule. And I think that that's where we are going to end up being. I don't think that we are going to have a result by the end of this year. And while we think that there is right now an uncertain result, I think that there can be 2 scenarios. I can think of 2 scenarios coming soon. Next year, the election is going to take place between March 30th. The campaign, actually, the actual presidential campaign is going to take place between March 30th and June 27th. If we are optimistic and if we were to find an agreement, the agreement could not be signed before the end of March. The reason being that there is a provision in U.S. law that requires a period of 180 days of advice or notification to Congress of the intention of the administration of changing trade remedy laws. So that puts us at the end of March. I think that if we are, as I was saying, if we're optimistic about the future of the NAFTA will definitely be part of the campaign discussion. If we have a breakup and if we do not have a positive result, I think that President Peña Nieto, the PRI, and whoever is the next presidential candidate of the PRI will have it very difficult to justify how the negotiation was handled. It will be very difficult to justify that President Peña invited then candidate Trump to the Pinos, the presidential house, in August of 2016. It will be very difficult to explain why Minister Videgaray was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. And also it will be very difficult to justify that we accepted to such a tight schedule in order to avoid getting into the electoral cycle. On the other hand, if President Peña is to sign a bad agreement, which from the agenda that I just laid out seems extremely difficult, that agenda may be positive for Mexico or maybe a win-win for Mexico, which is what we want. We want a win-win agreement. And we have said that if we do not have that win-win, that it will not be worth our while to sign it. It will also be politically costly for President Peña and for the PRI and for the next PRI candidate, because we will be the PRI, Peña, his government, his ministers will be seen as having given up, having surrendered to President Trump. And today, the polls indicate that Mexico and Mexicans are not happy with President Peña. Actually, his ratings are quite low, I think like around 20-25%. And Mexicans are not happy with President Trump either. I think that our opinion of President Trump today, according to the Pew Research Center poll, most recent poll, indicates that more than 60% of Mexicans have a bad opinion, a very unfavorable opinion of the U.S., and this is directly related to the Trump administration, compared to 25% just 2 years ago. So really, the damage that's been done to the relationship has been tremendous. So it's, I think that NAFTA, without a question, is going to be central to the election next year, to the presidential election. And as it was here in the U.S., Mexico and NAFTA were central to candidate and today President Trump's election campaign and played very badly for Mexico, at least. I think that it's going to be very, very likely that next year's in Mexico, the presidential campaign will center very much on the U.S. Mexico relationship, on the NAFTA result, whatever that may be, if there is a NAFTA result by next year, which we don't know either, but as I said, it's an extremely uncertain panorama. However, I think that this low in the U.S.-Mexico relationship as a result of the NAFTA negotiation, as a result of all the Mexico trashing and bashing that President Trump has done, will also affect other areas of the relationship, meaning migration, meaning cooperation in information exchange for immigration, for security borders. So I am not trying to be extremely pessimistic, but I think that we need to be very realistic about the situation in which the Mexico-U.S. relationship is. And I think that these events, like the one we're having today at the Bakery Institute, I think we should use them to inform a better debate and to to understand that we are neighbors. We may not have the same interests. We may not share the same assessments about the NAFTA, about globalization, about jobs, about immigration, about the border, about security. However, I think that we need to be very careful because this building partnership, a 25-year partnership, was very costly, and I think that it yielded some positive results. And these positive results have been already damaged very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. Gerardo, your next at bat.
Thanks. I speak from here, if you don't mind. I'll be very short. I think everything I could say about NAFTA has already been said, and much better than I could have done it by Luz Maria, and I agree with pretty much what she said. Well, first of all, let me thank Tony for having me here, and all of you for being here as well. And thank you to the Baker Institute for organizing this conversation, which I think, as Luz Maria said, it is very important for the better understanding of our relationship between Mexico and the U.S., which I think is crucial. We are here. We have been here for a number of years, and we'll be here with NAFTA or without it. So what I would say is one thing which I think is sort of summarizes what has been said already is the fact that next year Mexico, and this year as well, this year and next year Mexico is at a crossroads in different dimensions. On the one hand, internally we have a number of issues that are being part of the conversation in Mexico. People in Mexico is really mad and fed up with some issues, specifically with corruption, which is rampant, with insecurity, which is also rampant, and violence, and finally with the lack of economic results. So these three elements are part of the discussion in Mexico. These three elements will be part of the discussion in the electoral process. They are already part of the discussion, as I said, in Mexico. And on the other hand, we are facing as well this external threat. And I am very specific about saying this is a threat in the sense that, yes, the Trump administration, as has already been mentioned, is affecting Mexico in different dimensions. One of those is the fact that, as you all know, has threatened with deporting Mexicans who live here and who also contribute to supporting of their families back in Mexico. Many of them they have been threatened with taxing the remittances that they send to their families. There has been the threat of building a wall between Mexico and the U.S., part of it which is already there, but still there has been this threat. And finally, the threat of ending up with NAFTA, which, as you might know, has been the cornerstone of the economic model that we have been following for the past 2 decades at least, but which was pretty much the culmination of an opening of the Mexican economy back in 1994. This economic process started back in 1985, more than 3 decades ago, and this is which is being threatened by President Trump. So all this combination of elements, both internal and external, are setting up this specific situation in Mexico, which makes it very interesting for us who are living there, but who are also a part of a very vibrant political discussion in Mexico about what to do next. Of course, in these 3 dimensions, as you might imagine, there are different responses to how to attack corruption, how to address this issue. Many corruption, as has already been mentioned, is rampant in Mexico. Many governors are now in jail, accused of stealing resources, public resources, and doing businesses, illegal businesses with the resources as well. Many of them are in jail, others are on the run. So this is the situation in terms of corruption, in terms of violence. Everything started. Mexico was not that violent before 2006. Before that, we have a declining homicide rate. If you look at the numbers, we were becoming like a more peaceful country. But starting in 2006, because of a very unfortunate decision by President Calderon, who decided to start a war against the drug cartels without having a right strategy and without having implemented other measures, we started engaging into this a war which has costed 120,000 lives at least in Mexico. There are thousands of people disappear. Many people cannot find their relatives in Mexico. There are groups of people that are trying to organize together, to get together to look for people being enterrados, I don't know, buried across the country. So this is a very sad situation, as you can imagine, which happened across the board, widespread in Mexico. So that's the situation in terms of violence. And in terms of the economy, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, since I'm an economist, so I'm sort of biased to talk about these issues. But in terms of the economy, I think it's interesting. What I will tell you about the economy and why I mention this as an element that will be playing an important role in the election in Mexico, it is because the economic model that we have been following, probably if you read The Economist, for example, or you read other papers, or you have listened to Mexican officials, the Mexican economy is doing pretty well and has been doing pretty well for a number of years. That's if you look at those sources of information. But in reality, that's not the case. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, what has been happening in Mexico in the past few years, you will get with a different story. And you will understand why many people in Mexico is fed up with this situation, and why, as well, we have all these pressures for migration as well, for example. And do we have all this violence as well, which is fed by these youth which are unemployed and without opportunities to study as well, because the economic model that we have been following for the past decades has not been delivering all the results. And I'm not blaming NAFTA in this. I must be very clear on that regard. It is not NAFTA per se which is provoking these not so good results. It's something else that the Mexican government has not been doing properly in the past years. Just let me give you a few data. In terms of economic growth, if you look at what the rate of economic growth has been in Mexico for the past almost 3 decades, it's close to 2% per year, which is very low for a country with all the needs that we have. 2% per year implies that in terms of per capita terms, I mean, once we take into account population growth, that's less than 1% per year. That means that in the past 3 decades, we have been growing at most 30% in per capita income, which is not enough. If you just think what that means and why NAFTA has not been delivering all these results in terms at least of growth and convergence. When NAFTA was signed, Mexico was more or less the size of the economic size of Ohio, more or less, just to give you an idea of what Mexico is. Well, now Mexico is even smaller than that in relative terms. The idea was to promote the idea of having strengthening this trade relationship with the U.S. and with Canada was to promote convergence, to reduce the gap in development between Mexico and these two economies. Back then, per capita income in Mexico was close to 1/3 of the per capita income in the U.S. Well, today, it's still 1/3. We have not been achieving any convergence with North America. So the reasons why people want to migrate to the U.S. are still there. I mean, we don't have that many migration today for different reasons, but the economic reasons are there. So we haven't had this convergence process. We have been growing pretty much at the same rate as the U.S., but that's not good for a country which is relatively poor like Mexico. So this is one thing in terms of economic growth. Another example, poverty. Poverty in Mexico, and I'm giving you the official numbers, poverty in Mexico is more than 50% of the population. 50% of the population is in poverty condition, according to official data. 1/5 of the population is in extreme poverty condition. What does that mean? That they don't have enough income as to buy the basket of goods that could provide them the nutrients to be healthy, to have a healthy life, even if they spend all their money. Okay? 1/5 of the population is in this situation. And one half, which includes the 1/5, it's in poverty condition. Well, this is today, 2016, which is the latest data the latest year for which we have data. What was the poverty rate back in 1992? The official poverty rate as well. Exactly the same. So we haven't been able to fight against poverty, even though we have had all this model, all these economic reforms, all these structural reforms, and all that. We have now macroeconomic stability and so on and so forth, but that has not been enough as to achieve a reduction in poverty in Mexico. So, and that has to do with the third element, which I'm going to mention, which is inequality. The economy has grown a little bit, not that much, but a little bit. But poverty has not been reduced because all the benefits from economic growth have been reaped by a group of people which is in the upper part of the distribution. That's something which now we know. I mean, if you look at the numbers in terms of inequality, inequality has increased substantially in Mexico in the past few years. And that has to do with the economic model that we have been following, where monopolies are pervasive, where people are extracting rents, and so on and so forth. So the benefits of economic growth, which has been modest, are accruing to a group of people, which is, as I said, in the upper part of the distribution, and therefore we are then unable to fight against poverty. And finally, just to give you another example, minimum wage, which was already mentioned. A minimum wage in Mexico today, just to give you an idea how terrible the situation is for people who earn minimum wage. Minimum wage is today one-fourth, so 75% less than it used to be 4 years ago. So just one-fourth, yes. It's just to give you a number, in terms of, in the US, you are discussing whether the minimum wage should be $10, $12, $15 per hour. In Mexico, it's $4 per day. That's the minimum wage. So this is just to give you an idea how the economic situation in Mexico is, and why the discussion in Mexico will be focused on these three issues: corruption, which, as I said, is rampant; violence, which is rampant; and the economic model. Because the economic model has produced these results that I'm just describing to you. So the good thing, and I would say there is this single good thing about having Trump in the presidency of the United States, is that since he's threatening to end up with NAFTA, and NAFTA has been the cornerstone of the economic model that we have been following for the past 2 decades at least, we now have to start discussing what to do if NAFTA ends, which I think is very likely, I would say. So that's a good thing, because now we are discussing what to do if suddenly this economic model that we have been following for the past 2 decades ends. And that means that we have to start focusing on doing something about these issues, doing something about promoting economic growth, doing something about reducing regional inequality in Mexico, which is also very high. So what should we do in terms of labor income, which, as I mentioned, has been diminishing in the past few years as well. What to do in terms of promoting growth and development in general. And that's the good thing, because we are now really focusing on these very relevant issues that we have been forgetting in terms of the discussion, because the discussion was about something else all the time. And now, because of Trump, we now have to, it is as if instead of a wall, we had like a mirror. And now we have to look ourselves. And that's good. That's good in that dimension. And for that, I thank Trump, because, as I said, if it were not for him and for the issue that he's putting for in the agenda, we should still be discussing something else. Thanks to that, we are discussing these issues of the economic model. And that's going to be in the table. That's going to be in the table. And I think what we have in the election next year is there will be models that, or parties or candidates that are proposing to keep on the same line, doing exactly the same thing, and other candidates that will propose a change. Whether that change is good or not, it's again, it's like the discussion that you had in the US, like the discussion people had in the UK, to continue in the European Union or not, to do something, to do the same or not. Can we do the same and expect a different result? I don't think it's a good idea, but some people think that's a good idea. But the thing is that we are discussing the economic model, and that could be crucial in the discussion, but that everything, as you can see, is intertwined, the domestic issues and the foreign issues. And I think, as I said again, I thank Trump for that, which that's probably the only thing I thank Trump for, also, but that's good for Mexico, the fact that it's making us to discuss the relevant issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I guess to lay it out very quickly, what I heard is that there are endogenous challenges in Mexico. They have to do with the rule of law. People in Mexico are particularly angry about corruption. That's the number one issue in every poll, pretty much. The violence and insecurity, which is different than the Calderon administrations. That was very focalized in certain points in a confrontation between the state and organized crime. Now it seems a lot more diffused. There's at least 320 20 groups operating throughout Mexico in different parts, corridor cities, rural areas, and so on. So it's a lot more difficult to control. Growth without development, really. There is growth, 2% average per year, not enough, but there is growth, but there is no development. And so growth doesn't mean development, and I think Mexico has experienced that particular thing. And then now, added to those issues, economic and the rule of law issues, you have a new international environment, which has to do with two different things: international trends against globalization, and the rise of authoritarianism, I guess, from the Philippines to Turkey to Russia to the UK to the US. This reaction to economic liberalism. And then you also have in the United States the single most important relationship for Mexico, also a reaction against globalization and a very deep anti-Mexicanism in the administration. That makes for a fantastic pressure cooker. Things are cooking, and so we're 8 months away for this particular pot, this cooker, to either resolve itself or blow up. I think that so far, Mexicans have chosen time and time again an institutional resolution to their conflicts. I know it happened in 2000, 97, 2000, 2006, 2012, and it also happened in 2015 and 2016. If you look at the local elections those years, even last year in 2016, Mexicans elected governors, and everybody thought the PAN, for example, was done, and 7 governorships went to the PAN. So Mexicans have tried in every possible way to go through institutional channels to change the country. The question is whether 18 is a breaking point, whether we are reaching a point in which, added to the internal pressures and that optimism of institutional change running out, and this international context and this American context is now making for a very interesting situation in Mexico. The options, to me, are beginning to appear relatively clear. One is the PRI. I think the party spent. The popularity of the president doesn't help. And I think Luz Maria outlined it for us very well. The PRI has bet on a particular course of action on NAFTA and the U.S. relationship, and it's a very risky one. Mm-hmm. And they may lose, especially if the President Trump steps away from NAFTA. That's a losing proposition, and they will not be in a position to defend their actions. Mm-hmm. The second option is go back to the PAN in coalition with a couple of other parties. I think it's a bet that smells of continuity somewhat, because the PAN and the PRI administrations have carried the same model of economic development for 35 years. And then there is an option, a different one, which is Morena and López Obrador, where Mexicans may actually be fed up and they may opt for that other option. And it looks like things are essentially gelling into these 3 different options, and that's the 3 different options that Mexicans will have before them. And if you consider the PRI and the PAN and its allies very similar in their vision of Mexico, then the alternative is López Obrador and Morena. And that's going to be the great choice, and I think that's where we are 8 months away from an election and probably a redefinition of the relationship that is utterly important even for the United States. One more thing to open it to questions. Mexico will no longer have the escape valve called immigration to the United States, which means Mexicans will now have to stay home and deal with it. That valve, that escape valve, is now closed. And that adds to this incredible pressure that we're seeing, political pressure that we're seeing in Mexico. I think we have a few questions. Yes, sir.
I'll throw the first hardball here. For the panelists, thank you. Welcome back to your country that was stolen from your great-great-grandfather. And more important, how could the president of Mexico stand on the stage with Mr. Trump and not confront him about calling his people rapists and murderers? I can tell you right now, Mr. Trudeau, and I'm a Polish American, the Polish president would have jumped in his face. with a smile on his face. And the third thing, Mexico has a drug problem and a violence problem because of demand from the U.S. and the guns that are coming from Mexico. Excuse me, from Texas.
Anybody?
Answer the second one about the president not confronting Trump.
Thank you.
This began a long time ago. I mean, right? So Peña Nieto invited Trump to Mexico City during the election campaign. August 31st of 2016, Trump was behind the polls. Clinton had just gotten her bump from the Democratic convention, and two of the weakest points on the Trump agenda were one, that he was being openly racist, accused of being racist, and also that he wasn't seen as a serious person for international relations. Peña Nieto stepped in, and I don't want to say that Peña Nieto saved Trump, but I think that, people talk about Russia intervening in the electoral campaign. I mean, here we have a public, transparent intervention of the Mexican state, the president, in the American election campaign, in which he invited Trump for basically as if he was already president. They had a formal. They had a this was no. It was finally. It was in the final election. It was August 31st, and so Peña Nieto picked up Trump with the official presidential helicopter from the Mexican airport, flew him to Los Pinos, which is the official residence. They had a joint press conference. Trump didn't have the American flag behind him because that was against protocol, but it was as if he had it. I mean, it was like two heads of state talking. 2 hours later, that same day in the afternoon, Trump went to Arizona and gave his infamous speech, anti-immigration speech. And in that speech, he said, I really like Mexicans. Peña Nieto's my great buddy, but we need to do this, right? So that it allowed him to sort of distinguish between policy and race, between, national and international policy. He really intervened directly in the American election, and since then has been, Trump's best ally, both in domestic politics and in politics in Mexico itself. This is only surprising to those who assume that the leaders of third world countries have as their first priority their own people. Peña Nieto is playing the role of Pinochet or of many other, presidents of third world countries who take upon themselves their responsibility of representing foreign interests and not their own people. We're not used to looking at Mexico in that way. Mexico seems like, this democratic neighbor. Peña Nieto seems like a nice guy. He's not this, military dictator. But in fact, he's behaving according to the traditional role of these kinds of leaders. So I have an article in The Atlantic a few months ago, which, if you want to read up a little more on the details of that. But
Anybody here?
Wanted to add a little bit.
Let me pick up this question, and then you can answer also a little bit of that, and then this one, so that we can move the conversation. Yeah.
Mexico opened up its oil and gas to private enterprise. And they've gone out and bid tracts and things of that sort. Do you think any of that's going to change in 2018 with a new president? Are they going to still keep the oil and gas industry open?
So Carlos, and now you can say something about the previous question as well.
Yes. I was one of the team that created the energy reform laws, okay? Not that voted them, of course I voted them, but I was part of the team that designed the energy reform law. And one thing that the president of Mexico has full power to do is to stop it. Not to cancel the contracts. The contracts can be canceled if they're illegal. Of course, they can do judiciary maneuvering in order to try and do that. But I doubted that they will be able to achieve something unless something was done illegally. But the president of Mexico can immediately stop energy reform going forward, immediately, according to the constitutional reforms that we did. And it was designed that way. In other words, the Mexican state has the full power to continue, to go faster, to go slower, so on and so forth. So I believe that if López Obrador wins the election, he will stop it going forward, okay? And then, probably see what's the effects, et cetera, and reanalyze things, hopefully, okay? But I believe that to start with, he will stop anything going forward, the new rounds and things like that, okay? And I wanted to add to the first question one thing, that oddly enough, when President Trump won the election, the newly appointed Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Mexico, Videgaray, without being asked, was knocking the doors in Washington, to renegotiate NAFTA. And no notification took place, no nothing whatsoever. He was knocking doors. That's ludicrous to my way of thinking.
I'll pick up this question and then go to Luzma. And you can say anything about any of the questions, but I'll keep it moving. Yeah.
Thanks for all the comments. Particularly on the NAFTA renegotiations, thinking about a check on the president and a potential withdrawal, NAFTA would have to be, any change would have to be approved by the U.S. Congress. So how are the legislative relations, at least on the Mexican side with the U.S. Congress, and given the strong business lobby in the U.S. state and NAFTA, it's somewhat of the threat to withdrawal a bit weaker than actual, and maybe just some extreme position being taken, but perhaps not going to happen given the role of Congress to check and to regulate commerce.
Luzma. And you may also address the other questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, the first question with respect to the visit of the then candidate Trump to Mexico, I think that what it did accomplish was creating a 95% opposition to the President Peña's decision. We were all completely against it. As you mentioned, we felt really insulted by candidate Trump, and we felt really that it was completely, the worst political decision by President Peña. Actually, as a result of that decision, his acceptance rates came below 20%, I think, at that time, or probably closer to the teens. With respect to the oil reform, I mean, what Carlos is saying, it's completely true. However, I think that there's a point that we also need to remember. It's that the energy reform is a constitutional reform. So it will be very difficult to change the Constitution, I think, because you need a majority. We also need to go through, which I don't think any political party will have in Congress. And then you also need 50% of state legislatures to approve it. So
+1.
Exactly. So it will be very difficult to reverse or to have a change in the Constitution, I think. But I think that Carlos is right in terms of the power of the executive. I don't think that we can underestimate the power of the executive in Mexico or in the U.S. And with respect to the NAFTA question, I think that, we're just thinking about the renegotiation right now. If we were to have an agreement at the end of the day, I don't see the political capital of the Trump administration to go through Congress. First, because I don't think that Democrats are going to give him any victory. Second, because I don't think that there's consensus among Republicans that this is the kind of changes that they want to see. And third, because even among Republicans, I don't think that there is consensus right now on a trade agenda. Trade policy is not well-regarded policy. Globalization, I think, is in crisis, and trade agreements are in crisis. TPP is not there anymore. The last free trade agreements that the U.S. passed, if I'm not wrong, are South Korea and to Latin America, and that took 5 years to pass. And then when they passed, they had to be adjusted. So I don't see the political capital in the U.S. Congress to get any agreement done. And I don't see, for example, when President Trump talks about let's get rid of the NAFTA and go through bilaterals, even if we were to have a bilateral, I don't know where he could get the political capital to get that through Congress. So I'm extremely skeptical about any approval of any free trade agreement, be it NAFTA renegotiation, a bilateral between Mexico and the U.S., which I think is highly unlikely, or any changes to the NAFTA as it is right now. Thank you.
I'll pick up this question and then go to Gerardo. Yeah.
So basically sort of two comments. One, there's been almost 100 journalists murdered, and it's kind of hard to have a democratic system when you don't have checks and balances from the press and freedom of the press, transparency. So how do you see that changing in the future? And the second is, with only 1 out of 10 illegal immigrants crossing the border being Mexicans, how would any of you propose that we in the United States know who is coming in? There's people from all over the world crossing that porous border. It's not just Mexicans. So how would you rectify that if you were?
Yeah, Gerardo? You have, and then everybody will have a chance to go back to the questions.
Yeah. What I want to respond probably is to a number of questions that have been mentioned, and the concern that some people has in terms of what could be the outcome of switching political parties in Mexico towards a leftist regime like that of López Obrador, which I think that in the end, some of the comments that you have made are probably have this in the back of your minds. And it's important to understand something, which is that Mexico, that includes the question on the oil reform and so on. Mexico has all these institutions, including the fact that, as Luz Maria described, once you have this constitutional reform, it is not easy to remove it. I mean, because we have institutions. We have everybody who wins, either left, center, or right, will face a divided Congress. So nothing will be easy to pass. So whoever runs the country will have to do it probably at least at the beginning, doing administrative reforms, not legislative reforms. I don't think there is any margin to do more legislative reforms than the ones we have already done, particularly in this administration. So this is on the one hand. On the other, so we have these checks and balances in the Congress, at least. On the other hand, we have all these other institutions like the Central Bank in Mexico. Central Bank in Mexico is independent. And this is something that you cannot imagine, you cannot think of Mexico becoming like a new Venezuela, which is something that people has in their minds. Whether that's a possibility, well, that's not a possibility, because, as I said, Central Bank in Mexico is run independently by technocrats. We might like or not like what they do, but they do what they have to do in terms of fighting inflation. So you could not expect to have, even if we choose a different candidate from the ones that we have usually chosen in the past, to have a major disruption in this economic dimension. This is something that we should keep in mind. Even if someone doesn't like the energy reform, probably the most that that person can do is just to stop the implementation. Probably that's the most. I mean, cannot probably expropriate anything, cannot probably revert any contract that has already been granted, and so on and so forth. And probably once it's there, probably the cost of going on forward with that, probably in different terms, maybe. We don't know. But the thing is, it is not something easy to revert. So this is just something that you should keep in mind, just to if you are concerned somehow what the outcome of having like an unstable economy in the south of the border, I don't think that's the case. Because of, as I said, even though we have had these negative economic outcomes, at least in the process, we have been able to establish all this set of institutions that sort of keep the checks and balances on anyone who might run the economy. So that's something I wouldn't be concerned in that regard.
I'll pick up one last question and then give our panelists, each of them, a couple of minutes to answer. Yes.
Thank you. Full disclosure, I'm a political scientist from the other university. So let me just...
Which other?
The University of Houston.
Houston, okay. The public university, man.
No, but we're very good friends.
Interloper, right?
Institutionally and personally. But just a very quick scenario. And I think I study elections, and I think you're underestimating the power of the PRI. What would happen, right, if the PRI, instead of saying, well, we need to have NAFTA for the election, They are trying to set up a scenario where everything is going to go south. And then the Mexican government decides that they're going to step out of NAFTA before the United States. That would be the perfect storm for the PRI to win the election handedly, because as you know, the only thing that perhaps unites Mexicans right now is their lack of love for the United States. There's no more oil. There's no more national soccer team. There's nothing, right? And with that, setting that scenario, right, they could win just like that.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on that?
Great.
Okay.
Everybody will now have a few minutes,
few minutes.
a couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay, we'll start with that one.
John, yep.
Well, and that would get most favorable nation thingy with the WTO,
Yeah.
right? So trade would be the same, probably a little bit tight.
Well, Peña's already tried this in January, February, in the context of Trump coming into the presidency. There was a wave of, I wouldn't call it nationalism, it'd be more, patrioterismo is our concept. Mexico's patriotism, but sort of more superficial flag waving, orchestrated by Peña Nieto, supported by a whole network of right-wing or pro-regime intellectuals and journalists. They organized a big march in Mexico City, which was an enormous failure. It was just so hollow for him to suddenly present himself as a nationalist, as somehow a defender of Mexico and the Mexican people, given the context of what he so objectively has done in his relationship with Trump and even beforehand with his economic reforms. So I have no doubt that they will try. They are good at this, and they always try to get political benefit out of any crisis, even if it goes the wrong way. And I think you're probably right to question the optimism. Well, I don't know if it's optimism, but the sort of transparent reading of Luz Maria of the way in which the political fallout should be in terms of if we had a democratic context. But we get back to the point that we don't actually have a democratic context. We don't actually have free public opinion. To be able to actually force the government to pay the political cost of this failure. And they're going to try to manipulate it that way, of course, and they will be relatively successful. And that goes to the question in terms of journalists, right? Is there free speech in Mexico? I would say, if I had to say yes or no, no. There's a monopoly or duopoly in the television. In the radio, there's like 3 or 4 families which control about everything. Yes, social networks have been rising up, but there's still very much of a control over the media. The Mexican government pays about 36% of the advertising in the television. The Mexican government, Peña Nieto, over the last 5 years has spent 40 billion pesos, which is, how much is that would be in dollars?
$2 billion.
$2 billion just on advertising, right? When these are bribes to the commercial media, right? So we do have private media is dominant. It's not a state-run media, but in the end, there's a very serious control over the message. There is electoral fraud. We can get into the details. We have to have a longer debate with Carlos about this. I think that we do have wonderful electoral law. I've studied for the last 10 years electoral law. It's a wonderful constitutional and legal framework. The problem is that on the ground, it's not working. And on the most recent election in the state of Mexico, and also in Coahuila, which Carlos himself was mentioning before the event, we've gone back 30 years in the mechanisms of electoral fraud. I mean, there's direct, not only vote buying, but people are just ballot box filling, modification of tally sheets. We're just back to sort of the old ways of doing electoral fraud. In terms of the assassinations of journalists, beyond just sort of the corporate control, there's also violent control over journalists. So 37 journalists, just 2 days ago, the 37th journalist was assassinated during this sexenio with these 5 years of Peña Nieto. If you go back to 2000, there's over 120 approximately. You have to correct the exact number, but that's about the approximate 120 journalists have been assassinated. None of these cases have actually been resolved. And why haven't they been resolved? Because the vast majority of those cases involve government complicity. It's not just the narcos knocking off the journalist who's exposing them. That might be the sort of immediate cause. But the narcos are in the bed with the government officials, and the government officials cover up the investigations. And so we've just this last year, 2 of the leading journalists of La Jornada newspaper, which I write for, which is one of the most important national newspapers, their correspondents in Coahuila and in Chihuahua, who are, internationally renowned journalists. Javier Valdez had just received a prize in Washington from the Penn Club or something like that. I don't know which institution had just given a prize. These internationally renowned professional journalists who was assassinated, and to this day, we have no information on actually who, the 43 students from Ayotzinapa 3 years ago were disappeared, and we still have no idea where they are. They may be alive still. And beyond that, we don't know who. But the cover-up is so profound that, yes, we should not underestimate the power of the PRI and the authoritarian Mexican state. Just final comment to hand the ball over. In terms of what would happen economically if López Obrador were to win the elections and take power in 2018, I think Gerardo is absolutely correct. López Obrador is not a populist in the way in which it's used to disqualify some leaders in Latin America and the world. He's very explicit about what the central planks of his economic platform are. Whether you like it or not, he's absolutely committed to fiscal austerity. For instance, he has said that he's not going to raise taxes. What he's going to do is charge the taxes which are evaded today, which would, if he actually did it effectively, that would probably double the tax cut. In Mexico, we only take in about 15%. What's the most recent number of GDP in taxes? Doesn't go beyond 15%, 12. It varies. Yeah. It's very low, very low. Brazil takes in about 22, 23. Europe, of course, much more. But Mexico has a very low tax rate. You don't need to raise taxes. Just by charging the taxes which are already on the books, you can double that. And that can create lots of money for social spending, which is, of course, what he wants to do. The scholarships for youth, new universities, healthcare, and that kind of stuff. He's a welfare stater. And if you combine that with, rule of law, combating corruption, you have a better investment environment, really. This is doesn't put it at risk anything. It creates more stability and a more productive country. And so, for what it's worth, that's what I can see on that scheme of the economic side.
Thank you, Carlos.
Okay, well, I don't want to leave the audience with the impression that cross the border with a bunch of savages. Okay? Mexico is a great country. Mexico has one of the highest levels of happy people in the world, measured. If you hear John talk about Mexico, you will see that we're living in hell. No, that's not true, okay? Well, I just wanted to make that statement. Transparency. We have one of the most, I would say, best structured nationwide system of transparency in Mexico that was placed into effect this past May. Okay, at a national level, one of the highest well-structured system in the world in transparency. Okay, the only problem is that nobody is using it. The information is there at the federal, state, and municipal levels, okay? And we have the biggest opportunity because I'm an advocate for open government, okay, that started with former President Obama in the United States. is the biggest opportunity of really having contact, direct contact with people in government, using social media and information technology means, and a very well-structured system for open government. We have the under the new general law for transparency in Mexico, a move to have open government on a nationwide basis. So I'm an optimist, okay, in regard that the new elections may have a very well result, notwithstanding who wins the election, provided that the elections are legal, okay. And if we have really, the outcome of the Mexican people electing whoever they wish to elect, and the new government uses all these structural changes that have been done, okay, we have a great future for Mexico, okay. Yes, I agree with Gerardo that the inequality and we have the most open economy in the world outside. And inside, we are full of issues related to interruptions of business, barriers to investment, etc., monopolies, and the banking system is really one of the worst that exists in the world, because the biggest cartel that exists in Mexico is the banking system. They have the bankers association that they get together and use all the price fixing in the world. All of them will be in jail if they do that in the United States. And we have practically a copy-paste law in Mexico from the United States, but the institutions in Mexico do not apply properly the economic competition laws, okay? What I want to mention is something very that nobody has talked about today, and it's one of the biggest matters that is going on in Mexico, the resignation of Margarita Zavala as one of the possible candidates for the PAN or the coalition PAN-PRD Movimiento Ciudadano. And I want to share with you just a few words in this regard. What has been the biggest problem for Margarita? Felipe Calderón. Number 2, what is the biggest impediment for Margarita? Ricardo Anaya. Number 3, what is the biggest strength of Margarita? Herself. Okay. Number 4, what is the biggest weakness for Margarita? The PAN. Number 5, what is the biggest challenge of Margarita? Okay. Winning an election without a party. Okay. And number 6, what is the principal enemy of Margarita? Misogynist attitude of Mexicans. Okay. And I stop there because there's a lot more.
Yes. Thank you. We got just a couple more minutes before we need to close. So, Luzma.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I will not take the immigration question because I don't have an answer. I think that you're right, but I think it's a very complex issue, and I'm not an expert in immigration. Probably Gerardo will be better informed about that. With respect to the analysis that you made with respect to the PRI, I mean, it may well be the case that happens. Secretary Videgaray, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Secretary Guajardo, the Minister of Economy, have both said very clearly that they're thinking about Plan B. In fact, they had a meeting with some members of the Senate, and the senators were also very, very clear that there are some red lines for Mexico in this negotiation, and it's better to break up the negotiations as opposed to coming forward. So I would not dismiss what you're saying, and I would not say that you're wrong. I mean, anything can happen at this time, and the scenario is very, very, very complicated and very difficult to predict. The Peña administration has been handed with very difficult cards because let's say that, as you mentioned, the bet would be we will win the election by declaring war to Trump. I think it's too late in the process. The reason why I think it's too late is because we're already in the middle of a negotiation. If we were to break the negotiation, if Mexico was to stand up from the table and said, this is it, we don't want anything else, it will be very easy for President Trump to say, see, I told you, these guys are taking advantage, and they want to continue to take advantage of us. And right now, we are going to end this negotiation, and we will not sit down with Mexico again to negotiate anything. And my question would be, what would be the reaction of the markets? We are already seeing a lot of volatility in the financial sector. The exchange rate today, the peso is, I think, 19 to the dollar. It's been losing value in the last few days as a result of the uncertainty in the negotiation. And I think that even though some people say that the effects will not be that great, I do not share that assessment in the short term. I agree with Gerardo that I think that this will be a good time for us to think, what are we going to do if there's no NAFTA? I think that it's a time to make a very serious assessment of what's next for us, what's plan B, or I should say plan A, because it has to be parallel to whatever happens with the U.S. But I think that it requires a lot of courage in order to be able to say, okay, this is what we're facing, and this is what we are going to do, and it's not going to be easy. The fact that we say that there's most favored nation tariffs in the U.S. that are lower than in Mexico, it may well be the case for some products, but it may well be the case that 2.5% of a tariff may reduce competitiveness and may end up switching production to other places. Do not forget that the U.S. has 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. Central America, Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Chile, Peru are all trading partners with the U.S. So there are some products in the apparel sector, footwear, electronics that may well move somewhere else. I think that there are others that may remain, and many others will move to China. So I think that there will be a very important effect. Two-thirds of international trade represents two-thirds of Mexico's GDP. 80% of our exports come to the U.S. Only 16% of exports go to of the U.S. exports go to Mexico. So I think that it will create a very, very serious economic situation for Mexico, which it will not be the first time that we've had. We had the 1982 debt crisis, we had the 1994 peso crisis, the 2009 crisis here in the U.S., and we have no choice except to pick it up and do something about it. But it will not be easy. So I think that it's a very, very tough decision to decide that we're going to just break the negotiation, because I think that it may have very serious and very important impacts in Mexico too. Thank you.
Gerardo, 30 seconds.
Yes, yes. I'll be very brief. I'll talk about migration a little bit. I understand the need to regulate migration, and I think that that's a very important issue. And there is already a proposal which was organized by the Center for the Global Development. This was a bilateral task force in which I participated together with a group of Americans and Mexicans, politicians, former politicians, academics, experts, and so on. And we proposed an orderly flow of migration. I mean, migrant workers, that's what we need. I mean, migration takes place because there is supply and demand. Mm-hmm. And there is still the need in the U.S. for the Mexican labor force, and Mexican workers who would like to come to the U.S. and work and earn more and have a better level of well-being for them and their families. So the supply and demand are there. I mean, the economic reasons to have these migration flows are still there. So what we need to do is to have an orderly flow of migration. That's what we need, and that's this proposal. I think it's a step forward in that direction. It's a blueprint that you can read for the Center for Global Development think tank, which is a think tank based in D.C. The title is "Share Borders, Share Future," and I think that's a way to start the discussion. Of course, this is something that is never going to come up in a Trump administration, but it is something that we still need to think about because, as I said, it will be better for both countries, Mexico and the U.S. So I think that's the way to go in terms of migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. And thank you all for coming tonight. I hope this was not only enjoyable but informative as to what we can expect next year and the future of the binational relationship. Thank you and good night. Sí, claro.